going through or can help you much. So it's a tough time. So the transition itself, be prepared. It's not a simple transition. And so we can talk about the 10 things to succeed, but maybe this will be sort of a natural breaking point. Mohini, do we have any one or two questions you'd like to bring up?
Yeah, Paul, we have a few questions. A question which most of the people are asking is, do we need to have a management degree to be a manager?
And the answer is no. You don't need a management degree, and for the most part, a management degree doesn't really prepare you to manage. It prepares, I'm not saying it's not useful. There's two reasons I think that management degrees can be very helpful, and I've not only got an MBA, I've taught in 2 different MBA programs. It's the first thing that people get from the degree is the credential. So it will often speak to the management of your organization and say, I'm serious about this job and I'm interested in advancement. So it says, I'm willing to invest in myself. And so they say, oh, you're ambitious, that's a good sign. It has nothing to do with the content of the degree. Simply the fact that you've got it says that you're ambitious. The next thing that it does, though, is it helps you to think through the issues related to business and to learn the language of the business people you're going to be working with. But that said, that is a very small percentage of the job. So is it essential? No. I think over time, I tend to think of MBAs as being a lot more common sense and you have time to think up on your own. But I don't think it's essential. I've met plenty of fantastic managers with no degrees at all, and I've met plenty of managers who are just horrible with degrees. So I haven't found any correlation between having a degree and being a good manager.
Okay, we have one more question from Mr. Prateek Rupwal. He says, one of the myths discussed, said that a geek can lead other geeks well, and the explanation that you gave confused him a little bit. He says, how can a manager understand a technical issue if she has never experienced that sort of thing before?
Well, the thing is, you don't want to assume that because you're the manager, you have to be the expert on the technical issue. Because no matter how smart you are, no matter how technical you are, at some point, you're not going to know all the details. You have to learn to rely on other people who will have the details. I mean, if you think about it, think about the head of NASA here in the United States, the head of the space agency. He has about 20,000 people reporting to him. Now, if they launch a spacecraft and it blows up, he's the one who's going to be called before Congress. But he certainly doesn't know all the details. He probably doesn't even know the name of every spacecraft that they're launching, let alone the internal design issues related to every item. You have to be able to transition from being the expert yourself to relying on the experts. And that's part of the transition, is being able to let go of the idea that you as a decision maker or as a manager have to be the most informed person in the room, because you won't be. No matter how smart you are, there's going to be other people in the room who know more about the details of the things you're working on than you do. And so is it better for someone to have some technical background in order to be able to ask the right questions and listen to the experts? Certainly. But is it essential? No. And in fact, in some respects, it can often be a real hindrance, because you think, I have to be the expert, therefore I have to prove that I'm the one making all the decisions. And I see this a lot in technical groups. You know, there's a manager who's, they call a meeting and there's a big architectural decision to be made, and the manager sits back and says, well, I used to program in Fortran, and so I'm going to make this big architectural decision about this .NET system. And you ask him, well, why did you do that? Because you don't know anything about .NET. And they go, well, if I don't do that, no one will respect me. It's like, well, guess what? Making bad decisions doesn't help. You have to recognize that there are going to be other people who have more expertise than you do, and be prepared to challenge that, to test that, to check it, cross-check it against other people's expertise. but eventually you become a consumer of advice as opposed to being the producer of advice as a manager. So let's plow ahead here, and there'll be more time for questions at the end, but there's 10 things we can do to succeed as a manager when you're making this transition from geek to manager. Number one is get help. Find someone safe to talk to. And you need to have someone in your life who you can talk to with complete honesty about what's going on in your organization and what's going on for you personally. This can be a mentor or a coach. If you're lucky enough, it may be your boss, who may be someone who is sympathetic during that transition, as opposed to just wanting to demand things from you. But most of the time, you really need someone, potentially even outside the organization, who understands management enough that they can help you through the process. It gives you an opportunity to get advice from people who have been through it before, but also to vent, just to let out your experience and be able to tell someone who understands your frustrations and the difficulties you're experiencing. And it gives you an opportunity and a safe place to explore the feelings and the emotions that come with the transition, because you really don't want to pretend that those aren't happening to you, because what I find is that the people who try to tamp that down are the people who end up kind of unhappy in the role. Number two, get over yourself. The first response that a lot of people have when they become a manager is they get very impressed with themselves. I got promoted. I'm important now. I am great. I am wonderful. It's validation of me personally. To some degree it is, but my advice, get past that pretty quickly, because all of the things that you're experiencing in the role are about the role, not about you personally. So, for example, I eventually became someone who was managing over 100 people. And, you know, I would come to meetings and people would treat me with a great deal of deference, and, you know, they had a great deal of respect for me, and they would show that. But I always was very clear that they were much more, their deference was not for me as a human being, but for me as an inhabitor of this role, as an actor. And if you focus on the role more than the personal, you end up being a lot happier, because I decided to take a step back from management and return to technical work for a while. And when I left that role of managing 100 people, the same people treated me completely different the following week. And had I been very invested in, I'm important and these people should treat me with importance, and then the next week you're in a different role and they treat you completely differently, and you think, what happened to me? I'm suddenly someone who's not important? How dare they? And it becomes a real blow to your ego. Remember, the deference that people pay is primarily not about you. It's about the role you inhabit. And so if you focus on filling that role as opposed to thinking about how that reflects on yourself, chances are you're going to be a lot happier. The next thing is to clarify roles and relationships. This is really about not just your role, but about how you fit into the structure of management. Because as I mentioned before, new managers tend to think about things in ways that are very limited. They think very much about, think about it as children. Children think about the role of being a parent very much as, well, what is it being a parent like? Well, it's about telling kids what to do. From their point of view, everything is about the downward-facing role of being a parent. They don't know anything about all the agony you think about in terms of, their future and planning out their lives for them and thinking about what's the best way to get them an education and prepare them for a successful life, how you manage to take on a job and a relationship with your spouse as well as being a parent, and all the things you worry about. They don't know the full role. And the fastest way to learn about the role of manager is to clarify your relationship with everyone else around you who you have to deal with. You have to think about your boss. What does your boss expect from you? And by doing this, you can actually clarify this by going to your boss and say, what does your boss expect and need from you? And what do you need from your boss? What transmission needs to go between the two of you? You can then think about your team. There's, I'm not saying don't think about the downward-facing component of the job. Looking down and supervising is important. And you have to ask not just what do you need from your team, you have to ask what does your team need from you to be successful? And then your peers. Think about it. You have managers who either are your peers, who are working on similar types of things. What do they need from you? And what do you need from them, especially if they're going to be a source of support and information as you're making the transition. And finally, clients. You have technical sponsors, you have technical consumers. Who are they? And what do they rely on you for? Not just from a technology standpoint, but from a human standpoint, in terms of information, in terms of emotion, in terms of getting their jobs done. What do they rely on you for? And what do you need from them for you to be successful? The faster you get to thinking through and discussing with the people around you the roles and how they interact, the faster you're going to make that transition from thinking about management in a limited way to thinking about it in a more complete way. Number 4 is establish goals. This is be articulate about specifically what do you want to accomplish over a certain period of time. Now, new managers frequently do come up with goals, and I've coached a lot of new managers over the years, and what I've found is when you ask them what are your goals, the first thing they say is, in the next 3 months, this is what I want my team to accomplish. And that's great. It's good. They say, I want to finish this project and that project, and I want to have this project 50% done. And that's important for having goals for the team, but that's completely different than having goals for yourself. You need to not only have goals for your team, because as a manager, you are more than your team. You are part of your team, but you need to have goals not just for the team, but for the position. What is the goal for the manager of this team as opposed to the goal for the team? What are your goals that you want to have in terms of how the position interacts with others, in terms of how the position is established? What is the success criteria you want someone in this role, even if it's not you, to be judged on besides meeting the goals of the team? And then what are your personal goals? How will you judge yourself in this position? It's perfectly possible that your team may not succeed, but you can still say, I was successful in this role. So think about carefully 3 different types of goals: team goal, position goals, and personal goals. And number 5 is take some time. Don't be in a big rush to start making changes. Chances are it's pretty rare that a new manager is given the position of starting an entirely new organization. Usually you're being dropped into an existing position. You're taking over for someone else. And often what I see in new managers is they say, well, I see everything that's wrong here, so I'm going to fix it. In fact, I once had a guy who worked for me who was a brilliant engineer, just one of the best engineers I'd ever worked with. And one of his key roles in life was to drop into troubled projects. So we would drop him in as a project manager if a project got in trouble, and he would show up, and within a couple of days he would lock himself in a room, and in a couple of days he'd figure out from a technical point of view what was wrong with this project, and he would figure out what to do and fix it. And I would show up as his boss's boss, a few days later to see how things were going, and inevitably we'd have this meeting, and there would be, a presentation of an analysis of the situation. And it was very interesting because the analysis was crisp and brilliant, but you could look in the eyes of the people on the project, and they were all beaten down and unhappy because the way he handled himself, because he came in there and basically said, do this, do this, do this, you guys, and what they experienced was basically someone showing up and saying, you guys are so stupid. It took me to come in here and fix you. Because what you have to be careful of is making changes before you understand why things are the way they are will often be perceived as a repudiation. You can make everyone unhappy very quickly by coming in and not by saying it, but by demonstrating to them in some way that you think that they are bad and wrong and that you're there to save them from themselves. So often enough, when you've come into a project, spend some time and try to understand why are things how they are. Because often there's a good reason they're the way they are. That's not to say don't make the changes, but give it a little bit of time so you really understand why they became this way before you start to try to change things. because it's really easy to miss why things are the way they are and to lose the confidence of the team very quickly. Number 6, this one's a very simple one. Be humble. Nobody really likes a braggart. So whenever something good happens for your team, make sure that you publicly acknowledge them, that everyone gets a share of the public credit for the success of the team. And when there's blame, don't deflect it to someone else. Nobody wants to hear why it wasn't your fault. Just take responsibility for not only yourself, but for everything that goes on in your team. Even if it's things you're not aware of, you're responsible, and your team will appreciate it, and your peers and your boss will appreciate it, that you're able to handle it. Number 7, this one is the hardest one for a lot of technical folks, is that you, as I mentioned before, will no longer be a technical person. And you have to spend a little bit of time, feeling the loss of your work. Because most of us who come into technical work, we love technical work. We're drawn to it because we love technology, and it's very rewarding. And you're not going to be engaged with it the way you were in the past. It's just not possible. And so you don't want to be like my former boss who tries to do both and does both poorly. So if you're going to make a commitment to a career as a manager, you're going to have to make a commitment to reducing your amount of technical work and recognizing that it's not going to be your future. Now, I'm not saying don't do it. Do a little bit of technical work. As a manager, I'm very much in favor of people saying, I'm formally technical, I love technology, I'm going to carve out this little teeny piece of work for me, but it should be something that's small and off the critical path and not terribly important, so that if it doesn't get done because the other work is more important, it's okay. And recognize it's an indulgence, it's something that's okay for you to do for fun, but you're going to have to actually go through the process of grieving the fact that all the things that you measure yourself by right now. And as a technician, most people measure themselves by their personal productivity. What do I build with my own hands? What do I fix with my own hands? How much code did I write? How many desktops did I fix? How many systems did I upgrade or install? Those measures are no longer the things that you'll be able to look at and say, that's me, that's how good I am. You're going to have to transition away from measuring yourself by how you produce to measuring yourself by how you help others. And that's a very hard transition to make. The next thing is to just drop all the old ideas. As I mentioned before, you come to this with a perspective. And most people come to it as, oh, I know what to do as a manager. It's exactly the opposite of that bad boss I had back when. And it's often true that you'll learn things to do by recognizing the things that you hated in your previous boss, but that is far from the totality of what the job of the manager is. So again, you have to really go back to the idea of clarifying all of the relationships that you're in, because a managerial job is not about the technology, it's about the relationships. And it's much more complex than the idea of what it's like from below. Just as children don't really understand the role of parents, employees don't necessarily completely understand the role as boss. So it's something you just have to get used to, and the faster you let go of your old ideas, the sooner you're going to be available to those new ideas. Number 9 is stretch yourself. Not only are you going to be dealing with lots of new ideas, you're going to be dealing with lots of new types of people. You're going to be dealing with all sorts of non-technical people. Most of us as geeks, we work with other technical folks, and that's who we're used to dealing with. And so you're going to be suddenly thrust into a world where you are dealing with all sorts of non-geeks. You're going to be dealing with the consumers of technology. You're going to be dealing with vendors. You're going to be dealing with managers and managers of managers and business people. And they see the world completely differently than we do. And that's a whole different subject that we don't have time to talk about today. But recognize that they are not like us, and that they chose a different type of work. And they have not only different language, but different ideas about how the world works. And you're going to be dealing with them, and recognize that you're going to have to change how you interact in order to be successful working with those folks. And the last one is the one that people really don't like. Engineers don't like the idea of politics. That is, they think of politics as being a negative thing. But for a manager, politics is your job. Now, I should be clear what I mean by politics. There's two types of politics in organizations. There's positive politics and negative politics. Positive politics is what I describe as the process of groups making decisions. And that's what managers do. They drive the process of groups making decisions. Now, that means you might be lobbying people and trying to convince them of the right way of doing it, or this way or that way, or negotiating something that's going to be a decent balance between the interests of the two different groups, or 4 or 5 different groups for that matter. That's called politics. As long as you're doing what's best for the organization, that's positive politics. Negative politics is when you're deciding what's mine instead of what's right. Don't confuse politics with negative politics. Politics is your job, and as a manager, it's a big part of what you do, so you can't get rid of it. And finally, I'll give you a really quick tip. Because so many people in engineering, so many geeks who try management decide they don't like it and want to go back, my advice is try to find some very small managerial role you can play with and experiment with before you take on any title. Because it's very hard to say, I got a title of manager and I don't really want it anymore. I want to go back and work on the technology. And in my experience, about half the geeks who try management decide they'd really rather work on the technology. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's often very hard emotionally to step back from that role. And a lot of organizations lose a lot of people this way because they get promoted into a managerial job, they discover they hate it, and then they say, well, I can't go back in this place. I'll look like an idiot. Everybody will think I got a demotion. So you have to then be prepared to try it out before you actually take the job. And with that, I'll open it up to questions. And I'm happy to stick around for a little bit here. I apologize for running a little bit long today.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions.